Everybody, I'm Charles Dunham from the CER. Welcome to our hybrid event on Russia and Ukraine. Just a couple of organisational points. Firstly, for those who are attending in person, the microphones are incredibly sensitive. So if you whisper to your neighbour or munch too loudly, everybody's going to hear. So do be aware of the extreme sensitivity of the microphones. Secondly, I'd like to welcome those who aren't with us in person but are joining, a huge number who are joining virtually. So thank you very much for logging on. Thirdly, the procedure for asking questions, John, remind me, what should people do?
People should raise their hands if they want to ask a question in person. That's our preferred way of doing it. And the other way is to write it in the chat, and I will keep an eye on that and read out any chat questions.
Thank you, John. So without any further ado, let's move to our three speakers. First, I'm going to ask Iuliia to speak. She has had an epic journey to be here.
Almost.
She drove to Frankfurt and then got a plane from Frankfurt, but she's undergone a huge epic journey to do this. So really, really grateful. Iuliia is the chairwoman of the Transatlantic Dialogue Centre and much else. She's a very notable analyst normally based in Kyiv. So I'm delighted she's joined us today. She's formerly a diplomat and spent some time in London when she was a member of the diplomatic service. And she's an expert on conflict resolution. Then I'm going to turn to Richard Shirreff, who was D-Sacker, who also wrote a very good book published when he stopped being a general. He wrote a thriller called 2017 War with Russia, which is a very good book. I can strongly recommend it. It is about how Russia invades not Ukraine, but the Baltic republics. And it's well worth reading. And not only is it an exciting read, it's also very well informed, of course, as you expect from somebody who served in many conflicts, as Richard has done over the years. Thirdly, I'm going to turn to Tim, who's with us remotely because he's injured his hip, poor fellow. Tim is sitting in Oxford, and he will give us some historical perspective on the events we're going to be discussing and how significant they are and what the future might hold for us. So let me turn first to Iuliia. One question I have for you, Iuliia, which I'm sure you'll touch upon in your opening 10 minutes, is to what extent do people in Ukraine really think that they will perhaps need to compromise to get the Russian troops to leave? I mean, Russia doesn't deserve any favours from anybody at all, given that it started this war in an unprovoked way. But nevertheless, I'm sure everybody in Ukraine wants the soldiers of Russia to go home. So might you be prepared to give them a few face-saving concessions in order to get the troops out, or is that just unacceptable politically for Zelensky and other people in power in Ukraine? Tell us how it looks to you.
Well, if I may just answer this question at the end of my brief remarks at the beginning, because it's rather about negotiation complex and all the actors and the global actors involved. So it's not about the people who are willing to compromise right now. Ukrainian society is not willing to compromise at all for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, because we still have a strong feeling, and it is strengthening, that Ukraine has advantage on the battlefield, and the Russian strategy hasn't been materialized in the way they wished. So it is only the matter of time and question of price, which will be paid to get the complete victory. And also, I'm pretty confident that given this pace of resistance and eventual failure of Russian troops on Ukrainian soil, we will also have a moral right to take temporarily non-controlled territories of Ukraine, which has been taken by Russia since 2014, till the state border and the internationally recognized borders that we used to have at the beginning of the war in 2014. So let me just start with some sort of personal emotional reflections, because I'm not a emotional person at all. I'm analytic mostly and diplomat, so we are not allowed to express our emotions, but these days it's very difficult to keep them, especially when you're dealing with all this data and this dissemination of this information to international audience. So we're collecting pictures, we're collecting information about what's going on from different angles of this conflict. So I'll be ready to answer all your questions regarding different aspects, because what we've done, it's actually happened not like a pre-established procedure, but it came out naturally when the leading analytical centers of Ukraine adjourned to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense, started to share the information and started to pile up the mailing list with major contacts that we have abroad just to disseminate this information. And we are currently working as a sort of hub of these different papers, presentations on hourly chronicles of what's happening in Ukraine, and we're sharing this to all of our database available. And I'm quite happy that my previous experience in UK provides me with this ability not to reach just to politicians, to analytical centers. For instance, every day British MP asking me to provide information if I'm lagging 1 hour later. So just ask me, where is today update? And also I'm reaching to UK media heavily. Therefore, it's a very good opportunity for being here and to be able to share this with you. So all of us definitely already received this post-traumatic syndrome disorder in Ukraine, even myself. However, I'm a Kyivite. I was born in Kyiv. I had to move my family somewhere westwards some time ago, and still there is not a safe place, because when I left, my mom told me that they were kept in the shelter for 6 hours because of airstrikes on airports in some western regions in Ukraine. Then my daughter was in a different place near the Polish border, and when I went there just to collect her, to move her to a safer place in European country, the very day the Yavoriv area was bombed, so it was almost near her place where she stayed. So I'm not a relaxed person over here, because I'm worried for the family left in Ivano-Frankivsk. I'm worried for my daughter, which is left alone in Europe, and all this kind of stuff. So actions of Ukrainian government. I will be definitely this time, probably first time in 30 years, when I could say that I'm really proud of my president. I'm really proud of my country. This is true. Being a diplomat for such a long time, working with different presidents, and nobody expected Zelensky to act like this. So, and the level of approval and the level of confidence of Ukrainian public in his actions is extremely high. It's almost above 90% of Ukrainians who believe that Ukraine will eventually win, and the authorities are doing the right things at the moment. So reasons for resistance, which is very important for you to understand why Ukrainians just stood up at such a outrage towards the Russian invasion. No fear at all. We are ready to fight regardless of the price. However, it's very difficult for me to say like that, but I do express here the feelings of all Ukrainians. So, however, imperfect Ukrainian democracy for 30 years, we still have this privilege of open country. So we had made a lot of mistakes, selecting probably not right people to the government, but these were our mistakes. Not a single source from outside world imposed his rights to assess whether our government is good or not. So, and when Putin said that you're being managed by your own people, so we are going to insert proper people to you, this just created the outrage from Ukrainians. So we do cherish this freedom of choice, and this is essential element in our resistance. About civilians, what is important to understand, it's not just the Ukrainian armed forces that are fighting courageously on the field. It's also civilians who show their extreme unity with our military forces and ready to volunteer for fighting. So we still have long queues for the military outlets where just civilians also getting to form their resistance and to defend their cities. I could tell you one joke which we had. Probably you've heard some of the stories when civilians were with just plain heads, no weapons at all, but they confront Russians troops with weapons, and also they even can disarm Russian troops without any weapon at all. And there is a joke these days that you should never ask a woman about her age, you should never ask a man about his salary, and you should never ask a Ukrainian farmer where he has got anti-missile defense system. Because there are really plenty of stories like that, and even they started to announce a sort of, it's like a new sort of business, a commercial business, because people try to calculate how many money they could get for this metal once they deliver this further for some sort of processing and all this kind of stuff. So about one important element about Russian sanctions, when we discussed with Charles and team at the beginning, before this war broke in January of this year, I strongly defended the case that Russians would never resort to this scenario, because for different reasons, the costs for Russians obviously outweigh the tools to reach their goals with a different, more sophisticated, more intelligent manner. Because the final goal is to keep control over Ukraine, to have Ukraine in its orbit of influence. And they failed to do this. But one of my analysis, so we failed with our analysis because we tried to analyze with rational arguments something which is irrational. And one of my arguments was that Russians who consider themselves and pretend to show themselves as extremely spiritual Slavic people would never ever dare to put missiles over Kyiv, which is a spiritual cradle for Slavinism. So it's the origin of Kievan Rus. Kievan, Russia emanated from Kyiv. That is why Kyiv is a sacred place for Russia. It should be. But when we see all these missiles coming over Kyiv, so all logic just completely ruined. And which is important to understand, Russians already destroyed more than 80 churches all over Ukraine. And just in Mariupol, they also hit a couple of days ago a mosque where more than 80 people were hiding, and Muslims. And some of them were Turkish citizens, so they even addressed to the president of Turkey, Erdogan, for some help. And in Ukraine, in Kyiv, it's important to understand that Russians said that they're going to bomb the state security service, which is close to St. Sophia Cathedral. St. Sophia Cathedral never, ever have been destroyed in its history, neither by Tatar Mongols in 12th century, nor in Second World War. And Russians are targeting this sacred place in Ukraine. So it's just a reflection of how they actually treat the religious and spiritual factors. So brief words about negotiations. Being a diplomat, I sadly don't believe in any positive outcomes of all what's going on with the negotiations this time, because we see a sort of very low key, low decision maker level trying to reach some agreements which are not being implemented so far, even on such less sensitive issues like humanitarian corridors. The promises that Russians give, for instance, for Mariupol Green Corridor, just being completely broken. So if they can't agree on such minor issues, how could they agree on the issues of ceasefire or withdrawal of Russian troops from the land? And we don't have more senior level of negotiations so far. The recent meeting of our Minister of Foreign Affairs with Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia gave some glimpse for hope a couple of days ago. And I was watching these negotiations with some cautious, even not cautious optimism, but some curiosity probably, trying to find out what might come out of it. And when Lavrov afterwards came to press and said that Russia didn't invade Ukraine, so it was just unbelievable to hear from such an experienced diplomat in things like that. And we don't have the upper level of negotiations. Zelensky several times mentioned that he's ready to talk to Putin. Putin just ignores this. And so the only understanding is that this puzzle could be resolved if the leaders like United States, China, Russia, and Ukraine could come up to some meeting and to do something about this. I can dwell a bit later about this assessment. And recently we heard that Russia appealed to China for some military and technical assistance. However, publicly they denied this. Neither China nor Russia proves that they did this. But I would suspect that this is the case because Russia and China recently signed a memorandum on military and technical cooperation up till 2025. So it means that they have some sort of morality to turn to mutual assistance. But on the other hand, I'm quite skeptical about China's positive response to this for one particular reason. China is trying to exert its influence in Europe by economic means, by its famous Belt and Road Initiative. So it is interested in keeping these routes going. And most of them were laid via Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, not via Ukraine. And Russians, with all this boycott of international business, isolation from European governments, and all these kind of broken connections, present for China a very irritating situation to deliver, to reach their own goals of global power. Therefore, I think that it's not a very successful venture for Russians. So I would stop so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There'll be lots of questions later, but let's turn now to Richard Shirreff. Richard, were you surprised by the relatively poor performance of the Russian military, which is something you've been watching all your life? And in particular, do you think there's a risk of escalation so that NATO does somehow get drawn into a fight against Russia? How does it look to you?
Well, thank you, Charles. And firstly, it is a real honour and a privilege to be sitting next to you at this event. And we cannot but salute the courage, the tenacity, and the indomitable spirit of you and your people. So we just are with you all the way. To your question, Charles, I think the Russians have demonstrated, the Russian army, and if I were Putin, I would be putting Shoigu and Gerasimov on the first train to Siberia for a very long time. They have demonstrated extraordinary incompetence. They amassed their force. It was pretty clear what was going to happen. Now, the Russians should be much better at this. They demonstrated in Georgia that in 2008 that unlike most NATO armies, and we might come back to that later in the what's to be done piece, they understand the use of mass. They still have the ability to move really significant formations at divisional level and above. And for the uninitiated, a division is round about 25,000, 20 to 25,000, 3 brigades of 5,000, together with combat support, guns, engineers, combat service support, logistics, medics, etc., etc. They can do this, but they failed to do it this time, and one has to ask why. I think what the messages one's getting is that although they massed their force, the decision to go was made at the very last moment, and the planning and the necessary coordination simply wasn't done. And the result has been a pretty poor performance. I think Putin has made 2 classic errors. Number one, he's misjudged his enemy, his adversary. He was not expecting the Ukrainians to defend and fight as they have done. And he's misjudged the abilities and the qualities of his own army. And not only his army, but his air forces as well, because the Russians, again, by all accounts, and I only get it from the media, as most of you do, are simply not winning the air battle as we had expected. So what? And continued. So they had expected a two-day blitzkrieg. I think Putin thought after that it would be a victory parade in Red Square, back home for tea and medals, and Ukraine would be ground down under his regime and no doubt dismantled, puppet government, bits of it annexed, end of story. Well, it's not happened that way. So in a real sense, and Tim and I were talking about this recently, we have seen a miracle on the Dnieper, and we are watching a miracle on the Dnieper because nobody expected this outcome. Well, it's not an outcome yet, but we did not expect, 20 days into the war, for this situation to be evolving. And then more than that, of course, there's some really difficult challenges for the Russian army to come. They have not yet, although They're not yet fully occupied and subjected any town or city yet. I know they're in Kherson, but from what I see, the people of Kherson are doing exactly what you described, Iuliia. They're resisting without weapons, and they're not going to lie down. Now, if the Russians really want to go for it, they've got to get stuck in. And we're going to see potentially fighting on a scale not seen since the Battle of Berlin in 1945, if Kyiv is to be truly conquered. But they appear not to be ready or capable of doing it. The consequence of that, of course, is that they are rubblizing. They've just brought in air, they brought in artillery, and they're destroying the cities. Think, I'm afraid, Aleppo and Grozny. But there's another key factor here, which is that I think the Russian morale is rock bottom. I think they were expecting to be greeted as liberators. All the propaganda about nationalists and neo-Nazis, despite and anti-Semites, go back to Putin's speech in the Kremlin shortly after the Crimea was incorporated into the Russian Federation. Well, of course, it has not happened. There's another factor too, which is, by all accounts, the total failure of what was a very sophisticated operation by Spetsnaz and FSB, covered in quite a lot of detail in a very good Rusi paper, which talked about the undermining of state integrity, the elaborate establishment of networks of supporters, identification of potential opposition leaders, cyber attacks to deliver names and addresses and homes of potential opposition leaders. And what have we seen? Real unity, real spirit. So a failure of the hybrid operation as well. Moving back to the conventional fight, in normal conventional terms, you're talking about an overmatch of 6-1 if you're in urban operations. The Russians, I don't think, have got that, or they can't concentrate that. And this goes back to one of the issues with the Russians, of course, by attacking on multiple axes from different directions, north, east, and south. They've created really significant problems of coordination, but they've also split their forces. And that's going to come home to bite. So what? Where might this go? I think the most likely outcome, if you'd asked me a couple of weeks ago, I'd have said, I'm afraid, Iuliia, the most likely outcome was that putting my professional military hat on, that the Russians would, despite the tiger resistance of the Ukrainians, ultimately the Russians would prevail in about 10 days. That is not happening. The most likely outcome, it seems to me now, is that this tenacious, determined defense will continue. The Russians will get increasingly bogged down, and they will never win. I mean, this is, look what happened when the coalition invaded Iraq in 2003. There may have been a shock and awe campaign which did topple the regime. This is not going to topple the regime, but look what happened in terms of the insurgency afterwards. So even if the Russians ultimately prevail in some way, there will continue to be a fierce, that spirit of resistance will continue to burn very strongly. If I may just, so what can we do about it? From the West perspective, I think number one is continue to provide as much indirect support as possible, because there's no doubt, it appears to me, that the anti-tank missiles, air defense missiles are really having a decisive effect. If I notice, one of the worries I've got from the Ukrainian perspective, Iuliia, is that the Ukrainians, despite that incredible defense, do not appear to be able to generate really decisive combat power. I looked, for example, at the convoy which appeared to be stalled north of Kyiv recently, essentially packaged for destruction by effective, dominant air power and precision fires, together with ground-based direct fire weapons like tanks and etc. Yes, there was attrition of it, but it wasn't the sort of to coin a phrase, remember the Basra Road in the first Gulf War. If the Ukrainians had been able to create that sort of Basra Road, I think that would have done for Putin overnight, frankly. So that would be a concern of mine. The so what I think for us is yes to the indirect support. That's got to continue. I don't think we should be deterred by what happened this week at the little town just by the Polish border. Ultimately, the West has got a frontier from Poland down to Romania with Ukraine, and what we need to be doing is thinking agilely about routes in order to keep the Russians on the hop and to keep that supply of deadly and deadly capability going through. From NATO's perspective, I think the most important thing for NATO now is to really man the ramparts and demonstrate a serious deterrent capability on the eastern flank. And I don't see that happening. I don't know what the detail of it, but I want to be convinced that there's a genuine warfighting capability being delivered on the eastern flank. And that could take that's going to have to last some time. I don't see the alliance really getting into gear. We've heard about the deployment of the NATO response force. I came out of the NATO response force in 2005. We were a light force designed to go and do crisis management operations, which was appropriate at the time. It may have changed, but I'd like to see some heavy metal coming across from America. I'd like to see heavy metal and supporting fires, etc., being moved out of the UK. And Germany and Italy and France, and I'm not convinced that's happening. But the most important, and that is critical to me, it seems to me, to avoid any form of overspill, because if there's any form of overspill into NATO territory, it means that all 30 members of NATO are at war with Russia, which alters the scheme totally. Having said all that, I go back to my point about the Russians increasingly getting bogged down, getting fixed. And I think they're going to find it increasingly difficult to continue to generate the sort of combat power to achieve any sort of decisive effect. It's probably enough for the moment, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Excellent. I turn now to Tim. Can you hear us okay, Tim?
Hear you fine.
Good. Well, Tim, of course, Tim, as a historian as well as a columnist, you'll be thinking about the significance of 2/24 as alongside 9/11 and what happened on the 9th of November 1989 and other dates of history. How significant do you think these events are, and is it too early to say? How does it look to you, Tim, as a historian?
Thank you, Charles. Great pleasure to be with you. Sorry I can't be with you in person. Let me say a few words about the short-term prospect and then come to that question. Every peace begins with a war. The character of each peace depends on the course of the preceding war. And as both Richard and Iuliia said, the big thing that has changed in the last 19 days is the extraordinary civil and military resistance of the Ukrainians, combined with the Russian incompetence that Richard talked about. I'm afraid a true miracle on the Dnieper would be a Ukrainian victory, like the miracle on the Vistula. The Russians give up and go home. Very unlikely to happen, much as I would like it to. Therefore, I think the prospect is, as both Richard and Iuliia said, of a long war that ends with what Lawrence Friedman called a hurting stalemate, which creates the conditions for a peace negotiation. And our first objective has to be to make it hurt Putin as much as possible. And I say specifically Putin, not Russia, and hurt the Ukrainians as little as possible. Zelensky is very clear, Charles. He says three things: military support, sanctions, and the prospect of EU membership. Military support, we've done an amazing amount. As Richard said, there's some more we can do, particularly, I think, air defense, but also basic supplies to withstand a siege. But we're not going to go to war with Russia. We're not going to do the no-fly zone that Zelensky is asking for. So there's a limit there. Sanctions, we've also done a lot, but there is one big thing still to be done: oil and gas. And amazing though it sounds, it does seem to me there is a serious prospect that Germany could begin to move on this in the next few weeks. I'd be interested to hear from others on the call. Huge economic cost. Russian oil, gas, and coal is 30% of Germany's primary energy needs, 55% of gas. Very interesting paper recently suggested the cost would be between 1 and 2.5% of GDP, 1,000 euros a head. But the moral cost of continuing to pay into Putin's war chest is so enormous that I think that may begin to shift, and that would have an impact. On EU membership, the Versailles summit last week, extremely disappointing, but unsurprisingly disappointing. So let me come to the history, Charles, and make 3 points. First of all, it looks to me as if Zeitenwende is going to be one of those German words that's made its way into the English language, along with Angst and Schadenfreude and Ostpolitik. The turning point between eras. Now, we have to be a little careful because in rushing to proclaim things as global historical turning points, and we've only just finished declaring COVID to have been a world historical turning point. Before that, it was Donald Trump. Before that, it was 2008, the financial crisis. Before that, it was 9/11. What I do think is that this benchmarks the period that began with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991. This is the ending benchmark to that period, if you like, from the end of December 1991 to the 24th of February 2022. And the cause of it also lies in those events which I see Jeffrey Hosking there, Jeffrey wrote about so eloquently. Our mistake was to believe that the largest land empire in Europe could simply collapse with hardly a shot fired in anger in 3 years, and there would not be a violent reaction. We should have expected the violent reaction sooner or later. I first met Vladimir Putin in 1994, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. He was already going on about the lost Russian territories, the 25 million Russians outside the Russian Federation, long before NATO enlargement. And so 2007, Munich Security Conference, he declares Russia to be a revanchist great power. 2008, Georgia, he starts to act on it. At the latest, 2014, if we had done then many of the things we were doing now, we'd be in a much better place. But we are where we are. And this brings me to my second long-term strategic point. There's no point in going back to the argument about NATO enlargement or EU enlargement. I have a very clear view on it. Thank heaven we did it. I wouldn't want to be Estonia or Poland today if I wasn't in NATO, but we are where we are. And so strategically, there are now 2 separate parts of the answer given, Charles. One is what we're going to do to consolidate, defend, increase resilience in the existing NATO and EU, whose eastern frontier is now on the western frontier of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, and Moldova. And there I think we can be moderately optimistic, although I have to say, people are getting carried away with the great change in Germany. It's all very well to make those statements. What is this third largest army in Europe outside Russia, the third largest army in the world going to look like? What is German security policy actually going to be? Is German public opinion actually going to be prepared to sustain this posture, which has just been declared? Moreover, we're back to the old argument so familiar between Atlanticist and Gaullist. Scholz is very much on the line with Macron of strengthening the security identity of Europe as a EU identity. And so there's the old tension between the Gaullist and the Atlanticists that has to be resolved. But I think we can be cautiously optimistic about that. Where we have absolutely no answers is to the question what is the strategy of Europe and the West towards the former Soviet space, to everything in Europe or Eurasia that is not in the EU and NATO? We had a state of strategic confusion about this already for many years. The humbug of talking about future EU membership without really meaning it, the utter confusion of the NATO Bucharest decision. Ukraine and Georgia will be members of NATO, but without doing anything about it. But we're in an even worse place now. We simply don't have a strategy. And let me just say that we're going far too fast to statements like a new Iron Curtain. Some of you will have heard that on the Today program this morning. The situation is very different. And first of all, the Iron Curtain, let me remind you, was mainly erected by Soviet bloc countries to keep their own citizens in, right? In this case, they survive by letting many of their own citizens leave, those who are young, energetic, well-educated, and critical. Moreover, the network of ties across this line is so incomparably more intense than it was during the Cold War. So we're not just back to the 1940s and a new Iron Curtain, but the question is, what is our strategy going to be? And we have to have a longer term strategy for the former Soviet space, for Ukraine, but also, for example, what are we going to do about Moldova? An immediate challenge. Has an association agreement with the EU, has a mass of refugees, has Transnistria. Are we going to say simply to Moldova, that's it, sorry, mate, you're behind the new Iron Curtain? Or are we going to get serious about a longer term EU candidate strategy? People say, oh, but they don't control their own territory. Well, amongst the people saying that are Cyprus, who I don't think exactly control their own entire territory either. So I think there's a big strategic challenge there. Martin Sandbu wrote very interestingly about this in the FT. What we can certainly do, and this is where Britain can be involved, is have a clear proposal for a massive reconstruction plan for Ukraine after the war. Please let's not call it a Marshall Plan, because the last 50 years are littered with Marshall Plans that didn't happen. Maybe call it a Zelensky plan, but a reconstruction plan and a series of steps for Ukraine post-war, Moldova, Belarus, when it becomes possible, Georgia, to come into a closer institutional association with the West. And this brings me to my final point, which is that that long-term vision for a European Ostpolitik connects directly back to the short-term needs of eventual peacekeeping when we've reached the hurting stalemate. Because, I mean, I would love to believe that what Iuliia says is possible, but honestly, I think Zelensky himself is already acknowledging in such a settlement, they would already have to concede neutrality and some at least de facto concessions on territory. And that's not just Crimea, but the Russians are already insisting on the whole oblasts, the whole provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. And that's a very, very bitter concession to have to make. And my idea is, it is still in our power to give them a perspective which makes this feel like a historical win, even if it's a short-term painful loss. Ideally, it would have been not NATO, but EU. That's not going to happen anytime soon. I don't know, Charles, what your assessment is of what the European Commission is going to say, but that doesn't mean we can't offer a really serious European perspective, which would be something for Zelensky and the Ukrainian government to have in their hands when they come into this extremely painful peace negotiation. And I hope we'll be thinking very hard about that.
Tim, thanks very much. Now, before I throw this open to the floor here in the CEO's office online as well. Iuliia, you want to make one quick reaction, please?
Yeah, just one brief clarification on the possible concessions, because it means that I haven't answered your question as well. So we are not talking about neutrality right now. What President Zelensky talks about is about proper legal security guarantees, which is something that Russia also asked NATO about. And when we tried to get integrative thinking of what this might be, we've suggested that we should talk about European security guarantees, both for Ukraine, both for Russia. So it means that these security guarantees could not be just a complete statement on Ukrainians' neutrality. This could be something different. But the accent, the emphasis does matter, because I don't think that Ukrainian society right now would be ready to accept neutrality, because they will be looking at this as a sort of betrayal of something. And because it is written in our constitution, still written in constitution, the aspiration to get NATO membership. So I think that this would be very difficult to sell to Ukrainian society. Therefore, Zelensky's team is playing with these particular words, like having legally binding security guarantees also received from Russia. Which type of the security guarantees, time will show. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have one sentence on that, Charles, which is
Please do so.
just literally one sentence, which is, alas, you had those in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. Yeah. Russia, US, UK guaranteed territorial integrity of Ukraine. So quite what the value is, I'm not sure.
Well,
yeah, should we turn? I see Heather's raised. Let's turn to our online audience first before we come back to the room here in London. Heather Graby, ex-CR, now with the Open Society European Policy Institute. Heather, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. Really excellent presentations. So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for excellent presentations. So one question to Richard. How much more escalation do you expect from the Russian side before reaching the hurting stalemate? In particular, it's so much easier for Russian generals who are concerned about morale and the unwillingness of their troops to kill Ukrainians in cold blood, but so much easier for them to deploy long range and really horrendous weaponry. And of course, we all know what kind of technology Russia could start to deploy. So what would be your estimate on that? And Tim, in terms of the close institutional relationship with the West, what is practically most useful for Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia? We know that they don't need to start working on the 100,000 pages of the EU acquis, but it seems to me that a membership of the European Green Deal, for example, would offer them something much more useful by reducing their energy dependence on Russia, as well as bringing them into parts of EU membership which offer them practical possibilities that are immediately useful. Thank you.
Heather, could you repeat just the summary of your first question again? Because we lost your internet connection was unstable, so we didn't hear all your first question to Richard. Could you just repeat it in the outline, please?
Sorry. Yes. No, it was just about what kind of escalation Richard would predict before reaching the hurting stalemate. Because imagining it from the point of view of a Russian general who knows that his troops are demoralized, confused, and increasingly unwilling to fire on Ukrainians on the ground. So what kind of technology would he expect to see Russia deploy into Ukraine in order to try to achieve some kind of victory? How far does he expect, and what kind of escalation would he expect? Thank you.
Well, the only way, thank you for that. The only way Russia is going to achieve any sort of objective, ultimately, is to close with and destroy the enemy. And that means putting Russian infantry into the fight in the cities. They can ultimately, standing back and rubberizing cities is militarily unproductive. For the civilians and for the people in the cities. Actually, it confers the advantage on the defender. Again and again and again, you think casino. The Allies thumped casino to bits, and it gave the Germans the advantage because it just creates the most impossible conditions to advance and attack it. And then add to that determined defenders. It's going to suck up huge amounts of Russian infantry and other manpower if they're to seize those cities. So I think they will try and escalate, but I think very quickly they will run into trouble in doing so. And I don't think there's a great deal of technology apart from precision and other missiles and artillery, which is going to be much advantage to them here. So the escalation will come from engaging in combat, and that ultimately is going to be self-defeating.
Okay, thank you, Richard. One question was addressed to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Heather, thanks for a really great question. And my first answer is that I think CER and you should be working on exactly that. We should all, because it's precisely the question to ask. My initial response would be twofold. First of all, a big, generous, serious reconstruction plan for Ukraine, a multi-100 billion reconstruction plan. So, you know, homes for Ukraine would be back in Ukraine. And I think that's sellable to the European public, partly because of the enormous waves of sympathy for Hungary, I was thinking Hungary 1956 for Ukraine, but also because that is how the refugees, the many millions of refugees, get to go back home to Ukraine. Secondly, I so much agree about the Green Deal and other aspects. What that requires, of course, is a kind of paradigm shift in EU thinking, where you accept that you can have far-reaching sectoral integration with the EU without going down all the usual milestones to membership. And that's a conversation in which maybe even Britain could be helpful.
Let's take one more question from the screen before we come back to the room here in London. Pascal Lamy, member of the CR's advisory board, amongst other things. What's your question, Pascal?
Well, my question, Charles, is about China, which hasn't appeared yet in the conversation, which is a bit strange when you look at the overall strategic world picture. How much in the various scenarios which have been mentioned, how much of these depend on China's stance, short-term, medium-term, and long-term?
Shall I have a go at that, Charles?
Tim, why don't you pick that up and then others can follow?
Yeah, Pascal, always great question. Short-term, I don't think a great deal, because everything that I've managed to learn from those well-informed about China is that it's going to quite successfully sit on the fence. And I think it's quite unrealistic to expect it to be a mediator in these negotiations. I think that we should be looking to Israel or potentially to Turkey for mediation in the negotiations. And by the way, I think it's really important that we, the West, notably Scholz and Macron, don't see themselves in the role of honest brokers or peacemakers. Medium to long term, I think it's much less clear, because in many respects, of course, China stands to gain from having a West that is utterly preoccupied and a Europe utterly preoccupied with combating Russia, and a Russia that is increasingly dependent on it as a junior partner. On the other hand, if the whole integrated global economy, which you know so much more about, actually starts to collapse, then that threatens the stability of Communist Party rule.
Iuliia?
Yes, issue on China, also twofold answer. First, with regard to possibility of different countries playing a mediator role, and also why I still think that China is a good case to explore. First, in order for a country to be a very good mediator, you have to satisfy two criteria. First, to be seen at least impartial to both sides, and second, to be respected by both sides in order to at least to listen to what mediator is saying and be ready to analyze these advices and implement it somehow. If we analyze all possible mediators in terms of who might be an authority for Russia, So this leaves only China as possible country at the moment, which Putin might be listening to. However, even China is a questionable mediator here. I think the only person in history that Mr. Putin would be listening to is Joseph Stalin. This is the only authority he respects. And therefore, the attempts of Israel and Turkey seems to me not to be very prospectus so far. And therefore, I mentioned this quadriga of United States, China, Russia, and Ukraine as possible format. And I also could tell you that we are already assessing this feasibility in real life. And also the way approaches to China to get somehow involved. You also might be mentioning or recalling the recent talks of Macron and Scholz to the leader of China and their possible involvement somehow. And there were statements from Chinese leadership that they might be ready to consider international mediator efforts. So therefore, let's leave this question open so far. And also because I think that it's against China's interest to let the situation go and to support Russia because of their geopolitical strategy to enlarge the influence in Europe via economic tools. Belt and Road Initiative should be kept alive, and with these Russian actions, it's just being undermined somehow. And also the recent comment on geopolitical stance of China with regard to what might be happening in Europe afterwards. I think that they also quite keeping a close eye of what's going on within Russia in terms of possible different disintegration tendencies in different Russian territories. And they were also encouraged by recent statements of Japanese leadership claiming that Kuril Islands should be returned to their territory. So one of the possible geopolitical implications might be, given that there are some discontent in Central Asian territories of Russia, condemning actually Russian actions of Russian political leadership. I mean, right now, the people of Tatarstan, the people of Kalmyk region, they openly express their dissatisfaction with Russian actions. So China is sitting on the fence, waiting when Russia could be falling down and probably looking into their Asian territories. Thank you.
Right, thank you. You mentioned Tatarstan. I remember on a Valdai Club meeting in Tatarstan about 15 years ago, the Tatar leaders telling us Western think tankers and journalists and academics that in the Kosovo conflict, they were on the side of the Bosniaks, not the Serbs, which was quite shocking to hear that from the Putin-approved leadership of Tatarstan 15 years ago. They do think differently in Tatarstan sometimes.
And this is 5% of the population in Asian region. So it's quite influential part of ethnic minority. Therefore, it's very encouraging sign to hear from them.
Richard, do you want to comment on this one?
2 points. One, I'm absolutely with Iuliia that this. I think China, probably Xi is regretting that statement about unbreakable friendship, regretting the fact that he clearly gave Putin the green light in the margins of the Beijing Winter Olympics. And is probably pretty horrified by the scenes unfolding on the radar screens and his TV screens. And the fact that the Chinese were so quick to play down any hint of military support following that Russian request, I think is an indicator of that. I think they'll also be thinking geostrategically, exactly as Iuliia says, that this could completely unpick the Belt and Road Initiative. If you think of the network of Chinese influence across Central Asia, across Europe, into the Balkans, into Eastern Europe, Poland, etc., etc. I was at a Belt and Road Global Summit a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, and the queues of Polish, German, and other businesses and enterprises effectively queuing up to seek Chinese investment. That all that will be jeopardized. I think the other factor is, of course, this gives China, from the West perspective, with America hopefully focused on what's going on, and we might come back to that on NATO's eastern flank. This will give Xi a much freer hand in the South China Sea. And that could play out in economic terms as well, in terms of trade wars with Australia. One can think of a number of large Australian companies very exposed, those who export iron ore into China, very exposed. So I think there are a number of scenarios that could play out, and the instability piece. Finally, on Taiwan, I think if I was a Chinese military planner, I'd be looking at the way the Ukrainians have defended their country and thinking, Taiwan might not be quite such an easy nut to crack.
Right. Let's turn to some questions in the room here, and then we'll go back to the screen. I can see questions in both places. We've got plenty of time to answer them. We'll turn on to Lord Hannay.
Tim, you were unwise enough to mention Cyprus critically. Could I just suggest you reflect a little bit on how Cyprus may have been had some useful precedents. First of all, because it did in fact provide the capacity for the European Union to accept it as a member while it was still divided, and then to suspend the acquis communautaire in the TRMC, which remains the situation to this day. It would therefore not be a precedent, or without precedent, for the European Union to accept Ukraine, but to suspend the acquis communautaire in whichever parts of Ukraine were still held by the Russians, without therefore recognizing any change in the territorial integrity or sovereignty. Second point was, when the British had to finally admit defeat in Cyprus back in 1960, the price was 2 sovereign base areas in perpetuity, which they still are. Think Sevastopol, Black Sea Fleet, any relevance?
Shall I take that?
Well, Tim, do you want to comment?
I think it was to me just to say very briefly, David, that you made precisely the point I was trying to make, only much more eloquently. In respect of Moldova, it seems to me that it would be perfectly possible to proceed towards a candidacy track for Moldova, saying that Transnistria, which is territorially well defined at the very eastern end of the country, is exactly to be treated in the same way as we handled Cyprus. Ukraine a bit more difficult, but certainly I think Moldova, and I think to say that to Moldova would send a very important signal.
And Georgia.
Hugo Dixon.
Yes, I was interested, no one's mentioned chemicals and chemical weapons, and perhaps this is mainly one for you, Richard. I was struck by the fact that the Polish president said at the weekend that if the Russians use chemical weapons, then NATO would have to sit around the table and decide what to do. And that slightly worried me. I would have thought that NATO maybe already has been thinking about what it would do if Russia used nuclear weapons, and the EU and the G7 and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I suppose my question would be, what do you think we will do, and what do you think we should do? Will it change what we're willing to do? Should it change what we're willing to do on the military front? And will it, or should it, change what we, and perhaps this is not just the West, but the whole world is willing and able to do in terms of economic sanctions? Because although I think it's been quite remarkable how the West has come together on economic sanctions, it's also quite remarkable that a lot of the global South hasn't joined us. So that's my, maybe for you, Richard.
Well, I think it's a really, really important question. And let's not rule it out, because let's assume Putin and the Russians get increasingly bogged down, let's assume that as they try and move into the cities to attack and control and capture the cities with the sort of fighting on the scale that could happen, and that they are unable to achieve any success, what does Putin do? Create another problem. It's the old KGB tactic. Another problem, a bigger problem somewhere else. And I would not absolutely not put it past him using chemical weapons in Ukraine. They did in Syria. He sanctioned that, supported it. And so I think we have to assume the worst. I can't begin to comment on the so what to Ukraine because it's too ghastly to contemplate. But to your point about NATO, are they thinking, should they be thinking? Absolutely they should be thinking. And it's a point once made again and again and again that our political leaders should be essentially scenario testing, wargaming, different scenarios, building a sort of intellectual muscle memory so that when the worst happens, they've got some sort of answers and some sort of thinking. Are they doing it? I don't know. What could happen? It's the same argument, I'm afraid, for the no-fly zone. Any form of NATO attack into Ukraine constitutes an act of war by NATO on Russia. So NATO can only contemplate such an eventuality if NATO is 100% certain that it's ready for general war with Russia, and a general war which could very easily turn into a war of national survival. And I can tell you, you don't need to look very far. We are not ready in any shape or form. The mobilization, the thinking, think what happened between Munich and 1939. I mean, the answer is clear. We're still living in a sort of cloud cuckoo land that says this is a war, in a sense, in a faraway country. We've sent a few reservists, a few reserves. We've sent, a few more tanks, a few more, but we're not in any way, shape, or form ready for a war of national survival. So the answer, I fear, is NATO will do what NATO does, which is to say that it is a defensive alliance. It'll ramp up, but it will not get involved.
Thank you.
May
Yes,
I
Julia.
just add, yes, with regard to chemical weapons, definitely we are trying to assess different scenarios, and Russians, so they openly already blackmailed with this, but this is only just one possible scenario that they are going to resort to. On chemical weapons as such, our military experts say that there is no big efficiency of using chemical weapons onto Ukrainian territory to get the goals that Russians would want to. But playing with this issue of using tactical nuclear weapons that they've already hinted on, and also taking nuclear power plants in siege, like they've done already with Chernobyl nuclear power plant, with Zaporizhia nuclear power plant near Energodar, and they're trying to do this with Yuzhno-Ukrainska nuclear power plant. This is the next step that Russians are trying to do. So this could be very serious. This could have very serious implications on the entire European continent and the European countries. And it means that even if NATO is not or tried to avoid getting into conventional war with Russia, the after effects of these of their actions in Ukraine will be felt, literally will be felt in European countries, especially with this nuclear threat.
Thank you. Now, we've got a lot of people wanting to ask questions. We can fit them all in, but I think maybe not all panelists should answer all questions. So let's try. Now, next, John Peat from The Economist.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Tim, I don't, it sounds a bit parochial in the context of what's going on in Kyiv, but also the Zeitenwende in Germany. But I wonder if you think there are going to be some quite consequential impacts on Britain's relationship with the EU. I mean, to caricature it at the moment under this government, it's to be as distant as possible from the European Union in not just economic matters, but also even in foreign security and defense matters. Do you think that that's tenable? And do you think this government can actually change? I mean, we saw that Liz Truss was invited to the Foreign Affairs Council a week ago. Does that suggest Britain may actually start to revisit how distant it is from the EU?
Every crisis is an opportunity, and this is a crisis too good to waste. So what I would say, John, and actually CER is working on this, is that there's a clear strategic opportunity for a reset of the UK-EU relationship, which would say security, defense, and foreign policy are now the most important issues in Europe. There we have a huge amount to contribute. Climate change, energy, digital, these are big areas where we have a lot to contribute, and let's reset the relationship on that basis. So the opportunity is there. Whether this particular government is capable of leaping over its own shadow, its own, so to speak, demagogic shadow, and actually seizing that chance, and whether Macron and Scholz, who is actually quite close to Macron on this, are all that open to it at the moment, is another question. And there I would have more doubts. So I think it would be a great opportunity with another prime minister.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm turning now to James, going back to the screen. James Nixie, who recently hosted Svetlana Tikhonovskaya at Chatham House in a great event. James, do give us your question or comment, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Charles?
Yes.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Charles, CER, and all the panelists for a really fantastic hour so far. Two quick questions, if I may. So, Richard, you mentioned in your opening remarks about the vital importance of avoiding spillover. And I've heard you say it before in previous presentations you've given, we must erect a stop sign for Russia this far and no further. And it's a sort of a similar thing. And I just wonder if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, please, and tell me exactly what that looks like, or in other words, exactly how do we avoid the vital importance of avoiding spillover? That's question one. And then very briefly, if I may, to Timothy, and probably to Iuliia as well, but it's from Timothy's remarks, opening remarks. I didn't fully get, Timothy, exactly how you got from the tremendous advantage that Ukraine has created for itself on the battlefield to the hurting stalemate. I understood, of course, that you needed the miracle on the Dnieper and that, but I didn't fully follow the connection you made between what Ukraine has created for itself and the problems that Russia is undergoing and the hurting stalemate. There you are. Thank you very much indeed.
Did you hear that?
Yes. How do we avoid spillover? The answer is through effective deterrence, and this is deterrence. It's absolutely picking up Tim's point. This is not an iron curtain, but it is nevertheless a deterrent force from the Baltic to the Black Sea, potentially for as long as Putin remains in power and there is a threat from Russia. Putin has got to understand that any form of incursion into NATO territory will be met with overwhelming response. And at the moment, I mean, NATO is an alliance of what, 2.5 million men and women under arms. It outmatches Russia in every capability. But the reality is, in military terms, it's about having the right people in the right place with the right kit. And if NATO hasn't got that, however strong it can say it is an alliance, Russia could take advantage. So for my money, I would like to see the establishment of really significant armed forces from right across, say, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, to make it absolutely clear to Putin and the Russians that there is no way they could get away with any form of incursion. Think the sort of forces NATO had in West Germany in the Cold War. We're talking something similar, suitably adapted for modern warfare. I'm not absolutely convinced. You know, we don't want to go back to fleets of Cold War equipment, although don't be under no illusions. Many of those capabilities, modernized, are still really relevant. To achieve that, we're going to need to rebuild armed forces on a scale we haven't seen since the Cold War, which means reconstitution, rearmament, and significant increases in defense budget. That's not going to happen overnight. So in the short term, I believe there should be an urgent mobilization of whatever capability we can get in order, as I say, to sort of shore up, demonstrate that we're ready to fight. Anything less, and you know, the Russians respect strength. Where they find weakness, they'll exploit it.
Okay, question for Tim.
Yeah, love to hear Iuliia on that, but James, how do we get to hurting stalemate? Answer, the Ukrainians are entirely capable of making their country unconquerable and ungovernable. Maybe not of scoring a conventional military victory. Richard said it about the cities which the Russians do not control.
We lost you, Tim. I think, Tim, could you turn your camera off? Because that might help the sound quality. We lose you we lose your words sometimes. Try without your camera.
Can you hear me better now, Charles?
That's better. That's better. Yes.
So Richard was already making the point about the Russians not controlling the cities and what it takes to face down an insurgency, and they're well prepared for an insurgency. Fascinated, by the way, Richard, you take the comparison with Iraq. I heard David Petraeus the other day using his experience of counterinsurgency to give lessons for the Ukrainian insurgency. But beyond that, there will be massive civil disobedience and civil resistance. Think Gandhi in British India, and we're already beginning to see this in the support for the adopted mayors, the peaceful protests. And that combined with sustained Western sanctions, sure as hell makes Putin hurt.
Right, thank you, Tim. John, we have a question on chat. Would you like to read it out?
Yes, Christine Okrant asks, what has been the impact so far of cyber warfare, and how can we improve it given Ukrainian proficiency in the matter? I don't know if that's one for you, dear.
So, am I right to understand that how far is cyber element fits into all this campaign, or whether it is successful?
My understanding is what's been the impact so far of cyber warfare, I guess, from Russia, both on Ukraine and elsewhere, and can we improve Ukrainian defences or its own cyber ability?
As far as I understand from what we've seen so far and felt so far in Ukraine, there haven't been major damages to digital infrastructure in Ukraine with the cyber forces of Russia. And mostly it is because Ukrainian cyber forces are quite well and could compete with Russians, and also because our cooperation with their vis-a-vis in Western countries, in the United States, in European countries, are also keep growing. And on this particular element, we can't say that Ukraine is fragile, extremely fragile. Moreover, I can tell you that in the very first days of this war, our cyber forces managed to get the full list of all 120,000 Russian soldiers deployed for this war in Ukraine with all their personal data. The only other problem was how to disseminate this information in Russia. And this is something where Ukrainian side trying to be quite inventive, and I'm pretty aware that they're doing a lot on this particular area. And also I need to comment a bit briefly about interception of Russian mobile talks with their relatives in Russia. So there are plenty of these talks that we have in our possession, and also we disseminate them with English subtitles for you to get the sense of how Russians comment on this. And one of the interesting comments I heard that they were explaining how Ukrainian soldiers are looking like. They said, would you imagine that Ukrainian armed forces are looking like the cyber forces from Star Wars? They are high-tech equipped, they was very modern warfare, and we compared to them are looking like people from Subway begging for some money. So, and another element which is very interesting too, I need to comment on that. You mentioned that Russians were prepared for this blitzkrieg, and they even taken with them a parade form just to be on a parade in Kyiv. And also yesterday, Ukrainian forces captured the guy who was in charge of military orchestra. because they even taken these musicians to Kyiv, anticipating that in 2-3 days they will be in Kyiv parading on our territory.
Right.
So this is how it looks like so far, and the cyber side is not as bad as we probably would have anticipated some time ago, and also this equally goes for information campaign. We also heard from famous Girkin, who left, who fighted on the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk Republic. Propaganda and information campaign, and Russians are losing it. Thank you.
Thank you. To Michael McClay in London, Michael from Montrose.
To Richard, you were very critical of the Russian military performance, understandably, but in the south they haven't done that badly. And are the things that they will be learning? There has been greater maneuverability, for instance, and things they could do without taking cities that would take them up, divide the Ukrainian forces, and achieve territory. And one man's hurting stalemate is, of course, a frozen conflict to others, which has been put in strategy in quite a few cases. So to Tim, the frozen conflict that is, of course, hurtful, but it's there, how much would he camp on that with a revised requirement for Nova Russia, which is what he was talking about 4 years ago, because he'd have roughly that historic area, and would the West hold up in face of that being the new negotiating position? And then to Iuliia, how do you evaluate the Russians? They underestimated you, but how solid do you think these girders of Russian power, KGB, military, oligarchs, how do you evaluate them as this continues?
Really good point. I'm not going to comment on the detail of your question. That's a bit too sort of armchair generalship. But I do think there's a really important point here, which is they will learn. Remember what happened when Barbarossa was launched. The Russians were, the Soviets were a complete muddle and collapsed. But my God, they learned quickly. The difference, of course, then was that was the great patriotic war, and there was a patriotic fervor, which does not exist now by all accounts. But nevertheless, we have to assume that they will get their act together in terms of combined arms warfare, because they should be much better at it. And I think the reason they were so bad was because they hadn't thought it through. They thought they were going on an exercise, and they were suddenly bounced into the invasion, although they must have thought it was a possibility, but without the necessary really detailed thought, planning, wargaming, etc., etc. So I think the message must be they could learn, and as you say, that could the South could become an area where they begin to make ground. But at the end of the day, if they don't get the cities, they're not going to get Ukraine.
Yeah, evaluate Russians. Actually, we were not trying before this war. We are trying to assess the strategy they might be playing, and actually, more dangerous strategies would have been by using these pro-Russian agents and Russian loyal groups in Ukraine, and also Ukrainian business was heavily dependent in different spheres from Russia. What happened next after this invasion? So this is something which Tim smartly described as Putin paradox, and this is very important development which we need to bear in mind. So first, Putin wanted to achieve this leverage and influence over Ukraine, bringing more pro-Russian or at least neutral to Russia people into his orbit of influence. And he received completely opposite result. Therefore, it's we call it the Putin paradox. So he wanted to disunite Ukraine, to make this gaps between Ukrainians and Russians. You can right now easily travel from eastern part of territories to western parts if you are just hiding and looking for some safer place. People, Ukrainians, that the Russians used to call banderists or extreme nationalists, come out on the road, inviting you for shelter, offering you shelter. On the road, you will see a lot of places with some hot food and hot drinks, offering this to you free of charge. So it's a great sense of unity in Ukraine. And definitely there is great sense of a complete new stereotype of Russian that we've created. So there is a problem which Putin said for generations. So no one would be talking any longer about a big caring brother, but rather about a hostile adversary, an invader, an occupant, someone who we need to defeat. So there is no longer issue of brotherly relations. It's definitely not one folk, as Putin would like us to present. Then if we come to the question of different strata in Russian society and possible elements to whom we should apply, or at least refer to in order to get some sort of sympathy to what's going on and to shake Russia from inside, or we call it to awake Russians. Because all alone, as Tim rightly said, there will be really this hurt and stalemate at some point. But to change the status quo, we need some motion from inside the country. And this is very difficult to achieve because the society is completely totalitarian. So I'm communicating with a lot of Russian opposition people, and most of them are in exile, working from abroad. No one is in the country right now, apart from Mr. Navalny, who is in jail. And actually, if you listen to their comments or their prospects, what they will be expecting from the future of Russia, the prospects are quite gloomy because they don't see any possibility for democratic changes in the foreseeable immediate future. So it's very distressing. Then we wanted to approach probably the most efficient lever, it's mothers of the soldiers who are in Ukraine. As I mentioned to you, we've been quite creative in trying to search into this areas, trying to evade these mothers, at least through their emotional feelings for their children suffering in Ukraine or being killed in Ukraine, to shake this and to protest in the society. But the problem is that they're so afraid of raising their voice that even if a soldier calls his mother saying that, Mom, I've gotten captured and detained by Ukrainian forces because my tank was broken, she kept asking him about why did you allow the tank to broke? Not about, oh my God, what should I do? We need to get you as quickly as possible from this country. So the fear and depression is extremely high in Russian society. Therefore, what we feel to them is probably sympathy, just because it's completely different nation, which doesn't have this privilege to think freely and to behave freely as Ukrainians do.
Okay, now I've got 6 people left on my list. We can fit everybody in. They're all men. If some women would like to ask questions, I'd be delighted to make comments. Oh, I see one more. Excellent. That's good. And I don't see any hands up from our web or webinar audience yet online. But there's time to put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question. I'm turning next to Ian Bond from the CEO.
Oh, thank you very much. So one question for Richard and one for Iuliia. To Richard, you analysed at the beginning the shortcomings of Russia's plans. Are there any things that the Ukrainians should be particularly worrying about as this campaign goes on? Do they have logistic problems that they need to look into? And looking at the geography east of the Dnipro, do they need to be worried about being trapped on the wrong bank of the river? And to Iuliia, I wanted to ask about the economy, because obviously with at least 10% of the population, probably rather more than that now, displaced either in or out of the country, that must be creating quite significant economic problems. And I was wondering what's the sort of supply situation for not necessarily people who are in towns under siege, where obviously it's terrible in Mariupol and places like that, but for ordinary towns, are they still getting the flow of supplies that they need to keep them fed and supplied with medical goods and so on?
Richard first.
Again, a great question. I think the worry I would have is going back to my point about generating combat power. Defense is okay, and it's all very well, but without offensive defense, you're not going to win. And you've got to be able to. Every commander is always thinking, how can I generate a reserve that can deliver that decisive counterattack, counterstroke, in order to, you suck up the enemy, suck them up, get them really stretched, get them really fixed, and at the right time and place, bang, in you go with your decisive reserve. And it's slightly the point I made about that convoy up in the north. I would like to have seen that completely destroyed. And so that would be my worry if I was the senior Ukraine, the senior Ukraine leadership, is how can I generate that combat power? And if it means perhaps, and again, one's got to be so careful about drawing maps and putting lines on maps, but if it means concentrating and giving up territory in order to build strength for a decisive counterattack, that is something absolutely worth thinking about. One thing Ukraine has got is territorial depth. Unlike, and go back again, there's some lessons here from the Cold War. You think back to the Cold War, the latter operational strategy, and I say advisedly operational. It's not tactical. It's between operation. It's between tactics and strategy. So it's the operational level. That's the level that this war needs. That's the level which allows you to say, right, you concentrate, you give up territory, perhaps but you trade space for time, concentrate effort, and all the time you're attriting the enemy as they come back, and then put together that decisive counterattack to allow you to dominate. So that would be my way.
Yes, on economic problems and displaced, I need to highlight about these displaced people. What is a peculiarity of Ukrainian refugees to European countries? If you assess this with those happening of flows from Syria, for instance, most of them were tending to settle in countries like Germany, France, more wealthy countries. Ukrainians are forced to flee. They are not some people who would be very keen to go and to use this opportunity somewhere in Europe. So they stay mostly either in western part of Ukraine and in Eastern European countries, which are very close to Ukrainian border, in the hope to getting back as soon as possible to the country. What they do, they already, because we are hardworking nation, so those who've been replaced to some western parts of the country, already trying to get settled, to have some work and to produce something. So we don't experience, from my experience that I've traveled to different parts of Western regions, there are no shortage or supply chains are not broken. So moreover, this region is trying to serve as a sort of like a back office for those who are fighting in the east and supplying all this food and different medicines to the eastern part of the territories and Kyiv in particular. Then also another element of the economy, which struck me actually quite significantly today, our president was talking about reforms in taxation, making conditions for Ukrainian small and medium-sized business more comfortable in these circumstances, being able to cope with the broken ties and all this stuff. And then another element, which is also important, the external assistance that Ukraine started to receive, not under the government-to-government commitments, but also voluntary donations of some people like even cinema stars like Leonardo DiCaprio letting $10 million or some other big names, Elon Musk providing with Starlink free of charge. The decision of US government to provide us with $13 billion of international assistance also come into Ukrainian economy. So it's very difficult right now to have this equilibrium of economic model for Ukraine. I'm pretty sure that definitely the level of destruction is extremely high. and economy is suffering somehow. But I'm not going to say that this is a completely disastrous picture for Ukraine so far. Thank you.
Okay. I turn now to Robert Brinkley, former ambassador of Britain to Kyiv. Robert.
Thank you, Charles. Back to strategy. Ukraine's goal, which we support, is to win, that Putin's adventure should fail, and that Ukraine should restore its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. So I think it's far too early to be speculating about a hurting stalemate or Ukraine having to sacrifice control over Crimea or the Donbass or whatever in order to get a settlement. As Richard said at the beginning, the Ukrainian armed forces and people have performed far better than people expected. They're holding the Russians at bay. And with the support of the outside world, let's hope they carry on doing that and do eventually win a victory. Now, we don't know whether they will, but can I ask the panel to speculate? If they win, this is going to be not just a failure for Putin, but a humiliation. So what are the consequences for Putin and for Russia? Can he survive? For how long? What will come next in Russia? What will happen in Belarus? Can I ask you just to speculate a bit further out?
Tim, why don't you kick off first, and then we'll come back to Julia and Richard if you want to say something, Tim.
So to the ambassador, that you don't misunderstand me, I think we should do everything we possibly can, short of going to war with Russia, to help the Ukrainians to win. Let me be quite clear about that. Nonetheless, analytically, you have to think beyond that to possible and probable outcomes. And that's where the hurting stalemate comes in. If they had a real miracle on the Dnieper and Russia was simply defeated and had to retreat with its tail between its legs, leaving what, 7, 8, 9,000 Russian dead, it's hard to see how Putin could survive that, which is why he's clearly going to escalate. Charles, can I very quickly, because I wasn't able to answer Michael McClay's point about one man's, very quickly, hurting stalemate being another man's frozen conflict. Michael, I'm sure Putin would settle for that. He's been obsessed with Novorossiya, Catherine the Great, and all of that. But neither the Ukrainians would nor the West could settle for that. So the answer to your question is, if that was where he gets to, it's not frozen because the Ukrainians would still be fighting, and it's not a settlement because the West couldn't accept it.
Julia, next, then Richard.
Very briefly, I think that really even the situation as it is right now is very morally humiliating for Putin, who would never accept any kind of losing and being a loser. So ideally, if someone with rational thinking would assess that they're not getting as they wished, he could easily say at this very stage that, the special military operation has reached its goals, so we are just getting back and everything is fine, because his Russian audience would accept this. To the other world, it is obviously clear that a completely different picture, but that's okay. But Putin still continues getting into this further. And the behavior of Russian delegation in negotiations also doesn't show any sign of regret or defeat. So they still demand with these high-level ultimatums like what Ukrainians should do. That means that they are ready to get to the very end with all means possible. But answering your question, I think that geopolitically, the consequences would be a fall of Russian Empire as such, because it would be the fall of autocratic regime of Putin, which consequently would lead to the fall of autocratic regime in Belarus. And also, this will be like an example of building a democratic society in the countries which have this culture to think freely. Because, for instance, if you very important element, Putin made some sort of legislative changes in order to bring in the countries which are members of the Treaty of Collective Defense, like Kazakhstan, Armenia, Belarus, to support his military, special military operation in Ukraine. And what he received, they declined, so they rejected this. So even Armenia, which we thought that probably would be supporting this, apart from Belarus, but all other countries also clearly see the danger coming from Russian autocratic regime. And if Putin at some point in the past questioned the natural composition of Kazakhstan as an entire country, also speculating that some parts were given by generous Russians to this country, they also could be thinking about that what is happening in Ukraine right now could happen in these countries as well. Therefore, I think that I'm more optimist that geopolitically, he has already won in moral terms, but geopolitically, this is the path to the end.
Well, you described the best case, and of course, we have to hope for the best case, and we have to work for the best case. There are many more experienced Kremlin watchers than me here, but I can't see how Putin can survive long term. This has gone, what he has done in the last 20 days has put him completely beyond the pale. The so what is the importance of reaching into Russian civil society and the work that the BBC are doing and others to really get the message about what is being done in their name. Because until and unless that is permeated right the way through society, it seems to me that the system will hang on, will cling on. And then let's just hope even more for the best, because reaching out to that generation of Telegram users and the millennials and those who grew up since 1991, that must be the generation of the future. And who knows how they could be mobilized, but let's hope for the best. But we have to be realistic.
Professor Jeffrey Hoskin, that's been very patient.
Thank you, Charles. I was just thinking about Russia. We naturally focus mainly on Ukraine. But it seems to me that as a society, Russia is more divided and has lower morale than people have suggested. I mean, the very first days of this conflict, there was a petition of some 2,000 people in the academic world, in teaching, students actually included, who condemned the war. The Russian Academy of Sciences has stood back and has not supported the war. Indeed, the entire presidium has made a statement which talks admittedly not directly of war, but of acute military conflict, and concentrates entirely on the damaging effect this has for civilians, for health service facilities, and calls specifically, appeals that governments should not put pressure on scholars to prevent them expressing their views. And one can see, I think, that a very large proportion of the professional classes in Russia are secretly or openly opposed to this war. Now, that, of course, is not the majority of the population, but it does include a lot of young people. I think it's very difficult to fight what is clearly a nationalistic war with a society whose morale is low. So I'm still very puzzled by what exactly is going on. Why has Putin launched this va-bonk, as it were, when, I mean, the problems that he's talking about have been around for at least 15 years. Perhaps it's because the American abject withdrawal from Afghanistan gave him, additional encouragement. Perhaps it's because he's getting close to his 70th birthday. But for some reason, he's launched this desperate strike without the full support of this population. I haven't really a question, actually.
Well, thank you for the comment. And let's move on to the next point. And if our panelists wish to respond, they can have a chance to do so later. Let's now turn to Anya Richter from the Hans Seidel Foundation.
Yeah, I'm slightly hesitant. I feel like the German and the Roman has to somehow comment, but I will resist and ask a question, mostly to Iuliia, about Russian infiltration in Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk about wide infiltration in the secret or intelligence services in Ukraine, the mercenaries sent to assassinate the president, etc., etc. so far, to me as an outsider, doesn't seem to give them a massive advantage, or they haven't had much success. So if you could comment on sort of the real level of infiltration, or has it just not been used so far? And secondly, a wider question, because you've already asked about UK-EU relations, which I was going to. So I'm going to ask more about NATO-EU cooperation and sort of different roles they play in this conflict or war. Because for years we've been talking about NATO and the EU need to cooperate better, and the UK could play a role in this. So going forward, we're talking about sort of the EU's more financial power, or economic power. How can they coordinate or divide tasks lying ahead?
May I? Yeah. So on Russian infiltration, this is also something which falls into this category of Putin paradox, because with this invasion, what we achieved, the diplomatic ties between two countries had eventually been broken, because for 8 years we've been trying to do this, but how to do this, and all these business ties already also are being broken, not entirely probably, but the financial, the capitals, Russian capitals have been nationalized. There are laws taken of nationalizing all the Russian assets in Ukraine. So we are breaking all these ties. In the energy system, it had been told that Ukraine already freed from dependence on Russian nuclear stuff for our nuclear power plants. So there are some developments happening, and also which is also about Russian infiltration. So if we're talking about pro-Russian political forces, which were very loud and sound in Ukraine, like opposition party and all these people, we couldn't find them either. Either we couldn't find people like Mr. Murayev. He's nowhere. He's not calling to someone and taking other people to defend something in Ukraine. Some of the other politicians were detained because they were either making pictures of the Ukraine's military with the question why they're doing this for, and were transferring this data. The others were detained on the border of Ukraine when they were trying to flee the country. So we don't have this sort of political opposition forces. And very interesting about Ukrainian media, because I'm as an expert appearing and commenting a lot on international affairs and media on different channels, pro-presidential and also very much in opposition channels of Mr. Medvedchuk. These days, they turn to me with an invitation to speak. And when I ask them questions, so, but what line are you defending? Oh, we are all of us are pro-Ukrainian, patriotic, nationalistic, and they really support all the arguments that comes about the advantages and real victories of Ukrainian army and President Zelensky team. So I don't have any sense of these channels trying to put you through a different angle, supporting the opposition view. So that means that on this level, Russian influence is also, it's been downgraded to almost a zero. In terms of Russian infiltration in different political, governmental structures, it has become clear that Russians are going to play this brutal game, and the head of our National Security Council said that they've already taken this as the realistic scenario in last autumn, and they prepared to do everything just to diminish the possible negative impact, and also by limiting the sensitive information shared with different people within the structures. So you rightly mentioned that so far we haven't been observing a real damage from these Russian infiltrated agents in Ukraine's governmental structures. And also one of the reflection of this was that a couple of attempts to kill our president were unsuccessful, and these Chechen mercenaries were just destroyed.
Okay, got 3 questions left. So this is the last chance for those attending virtually to send in, raise your hand, please. And we're moving towards the end now.
EU NATO?
EU NATO, sorry, yes, EU NATO.
Quick pass on EU
Richard,
NATO.
yes, yes.
When I was Deputy Secretary, I was also an operational EU operational commander for the Bosnia-Herzegovina operation. So in a sense, one was part of both. But we gave that up. Anyway, that's history now. To your question, though, I think they are both part of the same. They're two sides of the same problem or challenge and solution. The EU, I think, should be focusing on what it's really good at. What it's not good at is sort of grandiose talk of being able to generate 30 or 40,000 soldiers and setting up separate operational headquarters, which merely detract from NATO. What it's really good at is sort of reaching out to civil society, economic reconstruction, development, etc., etc. Don't rule it out militarily, though, because there are certain niche operations where the EU is really, really useful and does a good job, like, for example, the counter-piracy mission in the Indian Ocean, which was part of a wider Horn of Africa initiative and a really good comprehensive approach. But what NATO is good at, or could be better at, but it's good at, because it's got a fixed command structure, it's got a history, it's got a common doctrine, which actually now, a common military doctrine, which most NATO nations use as their own national military doctrine. So build on NATO and work together with the European Union. And in this particular challenge is absolutely right for the closest possible cooperation between NATO and the EU. But there are certain, I could tell you some of the anomalies that still exist.
Okay, next question. Tim doesn't need to comment on that last question, I think. Okay, so next question is Stephen Carter from the New York Times.
Slightly following up on that point, and actually to Tim, who, when he was talking
Speak
about...
loudly so Michael gets you. Speak loudly so Michael gets you.
Yeah, slightly following up on that last question, and Tim, who, when he was talking about Germany and defence spending, this referred to the sort of tension between European and transatlantic poles. So I'm wondering whether how he sees European defence evolving, particularly in the context of the fact that the last president of the United States wasn't a big fan of NATO, and we could be one presidential election away from a significant change, and how it should change. Is this the moment that Europe should get serious? Is that what Scholz really means by Zeitenwende? And if I can ask another quick ones to Iuliia and to Richard, just in terms of Kyiv, how long can Kyiv hold out, and what's to stop the Russians just sitting there doing a sort of rather medieval style siege tactic and starving people out?
Could our panelists keep their answers quite brief so we can fit in all the questions? We had a couple of extra questions. So firstly, Tim, then Iuliia and Richard. Tim.
Yeah, great question. I mean, NATO, EU, Atlanticist goal list, so much depends on where Germany goes on this. Germany is crucial to that. The answer to your question is Scholz hasn't worked it out yet. There are two separate things going on. One is a certain goal list temptation to do everything as EU, working with Macron. The other is what you hinted at. Trump may be back in a couple of years' time, or a Trumpoid president, and we may have to do it on our own. The answer to where we should be going seems to me absolutely clear. It should be Euro-Atlanticist. We should be very much building up European power, also military power, but very much as a partner to the United States, not in opposition to or as an alternative to.
Speak through the helicopter.
Just one sentence. Kyiv is prepared for a very long siege.
Short to the point. Richard.
Kyiv will fight till the end.
Okay, fine. So three last questions. Carsten Nicol, thank you for your patience. Carsten from Telia.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. Can I just get back to the question around the, let's say, medium to longer term Western strategy for Ukraine, and in fact, the post-Soviet space, or the lack thereof, as we have basically heard from all three presentations in different ways. Now, from the Q&A, since then, I take it that the EU basically is the key lever here in this this search for a strategy for that space. Inclusion into the Green Deal, we've heard, sectoral cooperation that somehow stops short of full compliance with the acquis communautaire. But I would ask, in which way is that different from the approach that we've had before, keeping in mind that it was the EU association agreement in the case of Ukraine that actually led to the outbreak of military violence on the ground. So in that sense, what makes us so sure that the EU bit and EU cooperation bit is the right way forward in terms of strategy for the post-Soviet space? Thank you.
Who wants to go first? Iuliia.
Yeah, I will go because definitely we'll be dealing with this EU, different forms of EU attracting Ukraine closer. And I'm really skeptical about any new format which might enshrine, because it won't be taken in Ukraine, who actually literally gives their life just to defend the European values in Ukraine. Because we've gone through the EU common strategy on Ukraine, which was an extremely plain document. Then we've gone through the association agreement, which also has a lot of imperfections. And I think that opting for this strategy of organic integration from the bottom to up, by doing more intense sectoral integration, also won't be something sellable to Ukrainians. So we still need some sort of this big grand idea and exclusivity of our relations with the EU. For NATO, I also could be quite probably, don't take this as a very rude remark, but I think that our president right now has the right to say that a country, Ukraine as a country with such a strong army, is not fancying a very big military alliance to join.
Okay.
Yeah. Listen, I think this question, as I said at the beginning, about strategy to the post-Soviet space and whether we have one is absolutely crucial, because my nightmare, beyond what's going to happen to Ukraine, my nightmare is that has happened with so many other East European risings and dramas, is that after a few years, the West sort of forgets about it. That's far away. We actually do have a new division of Europe, if not an Iron Curtain, and we don't do anything serious about the post-Soviet space, which, to your question, is what in fact we have been doing anyway, while pretending on paper to have a strategy called the Eastern Partnership. But we haven't had a real strategy because people inside the EU simply do not agree on this. There are some people, notably Central and East Europeans, who want us to get serious about it. There are some people who want to get serious about it, but think it's very, very difficult because of how you keep the EU functional, what do you do about the Western Balkans, governance issues, corruption. There are some people, including Macron, and until now Scholz, who actually don't think you should ever expand the EU further eastward. Let's be clear about that. And there are quite a few people who think that we've already expanded it too far, that we'd actually be better off if we didn't have these troublesome Poles and Hungarians. And so we have that's why we can't get a strategy, because there's fundamental disagreement inside the EU about where we actually want to go. So here again, short conclusion, Germany is crucial. If Germany decided that we really needed what Scholz is talking about, quote unquote, European Ostpolitik, we might have one. If Germany doesn't get serious about it, we'll continue not to have one.
Right, thank you. Nicola Walker from Ford.
Thank you, Charles. I guess in the absence of any ability to really escalate from a military perspective on the Western side, I wonder if I could just ask a little more about economic sanctions. And I guess we've seen an unprecedented response, really, an incredibly quick and unified, coordinated response, really, in the big scheme of things. But are there any screws left to tighten? We talked a little bit earlier about, the spread into perhaps the Southern Hemisphere and whether there was more to be done from an economic sanctions perspective in terms of geographical reach. But in terms of a Western response, what are those screws left to tighten, and what might the impact be in terms of thinking about the economic impact on the Western population, the European populations who are perhaps bearing the brunt of some of these sanctions in conjunction with inflationary pressures that are already being felt, and how might that influence the Western response? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, starting with the last one, with international response, this is actually really extraordinary, and we are not talking about the reflections on the governmental level politically, but also of international business and companies. And in this perception, also Russians miscalculated a lot in their actions towards both Ukraine and the Western direction, and they also were counting that Western countries would be so rational to assess that the costs of breaking ties with Russia would outweigh some sort of high things, high values like breach of international order or something like this. So they were hoping that Russians won't be going far with their sanctions because of these material costs. But what we see right now, your stance on these issues are very similar to the Slavic one. So here we can see some irrationality, that there is something higher in moral terms than just plain material considerations. And on particular element where we can see added value, and this is something that Ukraine is asking right now, is to launch a complete embargo on Russian export of oil and gas, and to close all international ports for commercial cargoes and sailings of Russia for Russian vessels.
Timur, you wish to add to that?
Just one sentence, oil and gas. This is the crucial move now. It's very big in its impact. And to the question, it is hard to sustain. I mean, I quoted the figures, 1 to 2.5% of GDP, 1,000 euros a head in Germany, on top of an existing cost of living / inflation crisis post-COVID. This is quite difficult to sustain, but if we can sustain it, even for 6 months, even until next winter, I think that's a big one.
I was going to say oil and gas. But sanctions number one, enforce sanctions. Really make them happen. The other thing relating to the South is there needs to be a bit of a serious influence campaign, because I mean I'm Kenya born and bred. I can tell you, Kenya's social media is saying NATO had it coming to them. We should make no assumptions that there is universal support across the globe for this, for standing up, for the Western position. The West had it coming, so we need a bit of an education and influence campaign.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of our three analysts. Is that
Can I just ask one follow-up question, which is, assuming there is a peace settlement and the optimistic view that Putin exits power doesn't play out, I'm wondering what sanctions you imagine might be in place for the long term. It seems to me that some of the coercive sanctions in place now, like central bank asset freezes, are not sustainable in any peace settlement, whereas others like tech exports, we're seeing the US have those in place with Huawei for some time. And secondly, how much does that matter? Because certainly a lot of business investment is not going to take place in Russia for the foreseeable future from the West. So those are my two questions. What will stay in place and how much will it matter?
I can't comment on
that. I think that when the solution will be when the solution will be reached and some sort of negotiation and agreement we will see at the end, sanctions should be serving as the instrument of immediate action once the Russia breaks the rules, because this is something that might be kept Russia in order, at least, because they will have this experience of pain from the sanctions and all this wreckage in the economy from the period that they experience right now. And then this is the only probably tool to disciplinize Russians. So definitely sanctions will be freed if Russians make concessions and withdraws their troops and do some other actions in Germany.
Yeah, look, we impose these sanctions because Russia invaded Ukraine. If Russia leaves Ukraine with a peace settlement that's acceptable to the legitimate Ukrainian government, we have to withdraw some of the sanctions. We could probably leave some in place for our own reasons, but it's part of the incentive structure for peace settlement. Can I just say quickly one further sentence, which is, I am getting worried, and this goes to Jeffrey Hoskin's point, that Russians who are against this war are beginning to feel that this is really against Russia and all Russians. You know, taking Tchaikovsky off their conference program, cutting ties between cultural institutions with the Hermitage between universities. So I think we just have to watch out for that long term.
Tim, very important to say, yes, Russians are being hurt by these sanctions, but they're also punished by their silence, you know. So it's very, very difficult to say so, but because the society is so sleepy, they are not protesting the authorities. So it means that they also have to bear some price for that. So because of their silence, because they're afraid of saying something against publicly. So this is like.
Okay, last one sentence for each of you to leave us. We come to the end now. Let's go in inverse order. So Tim, Richard, and then you, Iuliia. Tim, your last sentence.
Well, thanks for a really great discussion. And to what Jeffrey said, I'm so glad we did spend a lot of the time talking about Ukraine, because very often these discussions immediately go off to Russia, China, the EU, the West, and you know, this is about Ukraine. Two sentences. One, I want to come back to this point about the strategy for the post-Soviet space, because if we don't do that, it will become a Zwischeneuropa, a zone of permanent insecurity, where all the countries in that zone will be doing what Vučić is doing in Serbia and playing off China, Russia, and the West. And that's not a good future, not only for those countries, but for us. Second point, Richard mentioned the BBC. In our parochial British context, the BBC has done a fantastic job of covering this conflict. In all respects, also the World Service, also the language services. So can we please, in our British context, to make this an occasion for telling the government to lay off the BBC?
Stay strong, win the battle of truth, and Slava Ukraina.
Glory to heroes. I respond. Yes, just one sentence, because a lot has been said over this brilliant discussion. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Then we do understand that the price will be high, and we haven't paid it yet. I mean, Ukrainians. But you have to understand that this is something which won't keep us from fighting. So we will definitely be fighting till the very last moment. The only God knows what is this actual last moment is for us and for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'd like to say thank you for a very moving and very educational seminar. We're all quite moved by it. Thank you so much to all our panelists, in particular you for coming on this way to speak. Thank you so much.